On May the 21st, 1927, Charles Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget Airport in Paris and claimed the famous 25,000 Orteig prize, offered to the first person to complete a non-stop transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. This feat immortalized Lindbergh, who achieved global fame through it and placed the United States of America at the forefront of aviation development.
Adding to the mounting totals of American Airways achievements, over 330,000 passengers carried safely in 7 years, over 50 million air miles, nearly 2,000 times around the world.
However, less than 2 weeks before, large crowds gathered in Paris to celebrate a plane known only as the White Bird. Flown by pilot Charles Nungesser and navigator Francois Coli, the plane, which had taken off from the same airport, was thought to have defied the elements and landed at New York Harbor, thus completing the crossing before Lindbergh. Yet, not too soon after the celebrations began, it was revealed that Nungesser and Coli hadn't even been sighted on the American subcontinent. In fact, they hadn't even been seen since leaving Europe, vanishing into thin air like midnight ghosts. Although initially assumed to have crashed at sea, over time, numerous witness statements and pieces of evidence began to suggest otherwise. Did Nungesser and Coli complete the Atlantic crossing before Lindbergh? And if so, what happened to them after? With so much at stake, a plethora of theories have arisen, and if we want to do them justice, I think it's only fair we go back to the start to investigate the plane that never arrived. Distinguished guests, I am Jacob, and these are the questions that remain. Between the years of 1890 to 1910, the world of aviation experienced a significant evolution. Countless early aviators curated, cultivated, and polished models of aerodynamics that culminated in the Wright brothers' momentous 12-second flight from Kitty Hawk in 1903. Over time, these trips became longer and more ambitious, with passengers and cargo becoming regular accomplices in such excursions. With World War I, the airplane proved its utility on the warfront, becoming a key player in many decisive dogfights. However, even with all these accolades to its name, it had not yet proven itself capable of making the great journeys that other conveyances such as the ship and the train had long made. Yet, with the conclusion of the First World War and nations looking to the skies for further growth, there was a sense that the plane could not just provide competition, but supremacy to other modes of long-distance travel. By 1919, there was a 10,000-pound prize on offer for the first transatlantic flight, which would soon be claimed by British aviators John Alcock and Arthur Brown, who flew from Newfoundland to Ireland. Although this was considered a milestone in aviation, many wanted to do better, and shortly before Alcock and Brown's flight, French-American hotelier Raymond Orteig released this statement.
Gentlemen, as a stimulus to the courageous aviators, I desire to offer, through the auspices and regulations of the Aero Club of America, a prize of $25,000 to the first aviator of any allied country crossing the Atlantic in one flight, from Paris to New York or New York to Paris, all other details in your care. Yours very sincerely, Raymond Orteig.
The game was on. In the first years following Orteig's announcement, there was little legitimate attempt to claim the reward, but as public interest in aviation increased over the 1920s and Orteig renewed his call for a champion, intrepid pilots began to attempt the $25,000 challenge. French flying ace René Font was the first well-documented effort, taking off from Roosevelt Field in New York in 1926. Unfortunately, his plane crashed at the end of the runway and erupted into flames, killing his crew. Despite the tragedy, the coverage renewed attention, with many other aviators beginning to develop aircrafts that would actually be able to make the flight. In the original letter, Orteig had only opened this challenge to Allied pilots, but had since adjusted it so that anyone eligible could participate. Nevertheless, the two countries which emerged as favorites for the prize were the two that seemed the most relevant, the United States and France. However, although the Americans were well represented, with scores of patriotic pilots lining up to be the first to make that unprecedented crossing, across the pond, two French flying veterans were measuring up their own chances of making history. Francois Coli was what you might describe as a military polymath. Born to a family of Corsican sailors, he had served in the Navy, Army, and Air Force capacities throughout his lifetime, most notably during World War I, where he was awarded a French War Cross and a Legion of Honor. He suffered multiple injuries during his service, including the loss of his right eye, but only seemed to intensify his pursuits following the war, co-piloting multiple record-setting flights. With trips across the Mediterranean already under his belt, it was in 1923 that he began to plan a more ambitious voyage over the Atlantic Ocean, but with a twist. Unlike other aviators who had traveled from New York to Paris, his plane would travel from Paris to New York. This seemed somewhat irrational, given that it was common knowledge that eastbound flights were carried by a stronger headwind, but Coli believed that having the last third of the flight over land would ensure a safer trip. Mapping a route known as the Great Circle, he partnered with World War I flying ace Paul Terrasson and began test runs for the upcoming passage. However, when an accident ruled both Terrasson and the aircraft out of attempting any such feat, Coli needed a plan B. Charles Nungesser was a flamboyant and occasionally controversial figure. He was also the third most successful French flying ace of World War I, with 43 confirmed combat victories and 17 separate injuries. After his success in the war, he had pursued various careers, including that of an aircraft designer, an educator, an entrepreneur, and an actor, even appearing in the silent Hollywood film The Sky Raider as none other than Captain Charles Nungesser. All of these ventures failed to pay dividends, though, and come 1927, the French ace found himself in a financial trench. To add insult to injury, his spouse had divorced him at the request of a rich father who despised Nungesser, and she would only consider returning if he could provide for both of them. Allured by the implications of a handsome payout, and inspired by previous ventures into the world of performance piloting, he allied with constructor Pierre Levasseur and conceptualized the White Bird, a single-engine, two-seat biplane with a distinct white color to make it easier to spot at sea. Nungesser had initially planned to make the flight alone, but Levasseur encouraged him to take on a navigator, of which was to be Francois Coli, who gladly accepted the invitation to work with someone as prestigious. On paper, such a combination of experience and expertise would be hard to contend with, but with other competitors moving closer and closer to making that flight, there was no time for either of them to waste. The plane was constructed, tests were run, and the flight was planned. Now all that was left was to actually do it.
We are taking a risk, I know, but we are taking it willingly and with all our hearts.
It was the early hours of the morning on May the 8th, 1927. Two heavily dressed figures trudged their way towards the single-engine biplane. The weather, a drizzle accompanied by distant thunderstorms, seemed to foreshadow the potential trouble that lay ahead. Yet Coli and Nungesser were undeterred by the reports of the possible adversity which had spooked many of their contemporaries. As the clouds cleared and the sun began to awaken from its slumber, the two men boarded the contraption and took to the skies. This bold departure seemed in part due to the mounting pressure from both sides of the Atlantic. French and American pilots had made multiple attempts and tests in the months prior, with some even resulting in accidents and fatalities. Despite previous entries, neither Nungesser nor Coli had formally entered themselves for the Orteig prize this time around. However, by this point, there was a sense that formalities didn't matter, and Raymond Orteig agreed that they would be entitled to the prize regardless. Although nobody had done it yet, there was a sense that aviation was on the precipice of a breakthrough. The feverish mood was almost thwarted as the plane battled its immense mass on takeoff, rising and dipping with each spectator's nerves. But eventually, against the odds and against the wind, it ascended to the skies. They were escorted to the coast of their homeland by 4 media and military airplanes before they were left to brave the foreign waters alone. Sightings followed, both in England and Ireland, and they appeared to be making strong progress. However, the greatest challenge beckoned: navigating the Atlantic. Nungesser opted to fly without a radio, telling engineer Levasseur, "You fly with petrol, not with wireless sets." This was a smart decision with mind to fuel efficiency and range, but also ensured that for approximately 20 hours, there would be little update until the White Bird made landfall. For 20 hours, Nungesser and Coli could have been anywhere in the world, and the public would be none the wiser as to where, for all they knew, they could be dead. Yet, on the afternoon of May the 9th, or the morning of May the 9th if you were waiting in New York, sightings began to be reported from the other side of the pond. First off Newfoundland, then Portland, Maine, then Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It appeared that the pilots were on a course for their historic landing. In New York, a large crowd joined by a committee of public figures awaited Nungesser and Coli's triumphant descent into the New York harbor. In Paris, excited civilians lined the streets awaiting confirmation that their air ambassadors had succeeded where many had failed. It didn't matter where you were, you could cut the tension with a knife. Then, in early evening, the news finally broke. Tabloid newspaper La Presse excitedly declared that the Atlantic is conquered, explaining that Nungesser and Coli had executed a perfect landing in the New York harbor, and that celebrations had already begun. French crowds erupted into a revelry that had been years in the making. More headlines followed, which only seemed to reaffirm people's jubilations. Franco-American publications held out on the announcement, but suffered consequences from angry citizens who thought they were trying to rain on the parade of two heroes who had surmounted the insurmountable. In spite of the joyous French headlines, there was a reason that a few papers had not reported on the news. There was no evidence of the plane landing, and as the night closed in, many papers had to concede that they did not actually know as to the whereabouts of the aircraft or the two men in it. The sightings along the American coast were later said to be erroneous, and La Presse's statement was a typical example of a release designed to coincide with the event. Not an uncommon occurrence, but still an important one when it concerned a matter of national pride. Over in New York, as the likelihood of Nungesser and Coli's arrival thinned too. And eventually, despair began to set in as people realized they didn't have enough fuel to still be up in the skies. On learning the news, many French outlets were embarrassed. La Presse eventually filed for bankruptcy due to the ensuing loss of reputation. But the true loss was of the proud airmen. In the diplomatic sphere, debates raged on as to who was to blame, most parties absolving themselves of any responsibility, ultimately stating that the French flyers made a bold but perhaps foolish decision. A search signed off by President Calvin Coolidge was launched off the northeast coast of the United States to find the missing individuals. Searchlights, military and fishing vessels, every resource that could be thrown into finding the White Bird and its two occupants, with philanthropists offering generous rewards for their recovery. The route taken was retraced by dozens of other pilots who believed that there was still some chance that they just hadn't been found yet. Given the established route and the experience of the pilots, most assumed that there was a pretty narrow course for them to have crashed all along. This didn't stop the theories from reaching far and wide, though, with one of Nungesser's brothers suggesting that they were somewhere in the English Channel, while others contested that they may have made it as far as America. But no matter how far and wide the rescue crews searched, there was simply no sign of the aircraft or the men who had bravely stepped into it that fateful May day. Many began to assume that if they couldn't be found, they were likely lost in the jaws of the Atlantic, swept away by a storm that not even they could conquer. And just as they were swept away, their memory was too. 11 days after the White Bird disappeared, making its treacherous journey, a then little-known advisor by the name of Charles Lindbergh would snatch the world's attention by making his own trip across the Atlantic in his high-wing monoplace, the Spirit of St. Louis. His trip was not without its perils, but on the morning of May the 21st, Lindbergh made his arrival into Paris, circled the Eiffel Tower, and then landed at Le Bourget Aerodrome, where Nungesser and Coli had taken off from. Lindbergh would become an overnight sensation. Songs were written about his achievement. He was mobbed by large crowds. He held back-to-back meetings with royal families and international diplomats, and collected countless decorations and honors. He was one of the few people to be awarded a Medal of Honor, despite never having fought in a military engagement. He was appointed Time's first ever Man of the Year, and published a best-selling autobiography in less than 2 months. In America, he even lent his name to the Lindbergh Boom, a period of revolution in aviation where interest and participation in air travel experienced exponential growth. Although the citizens of France were still in grief over the loss of the two great French adventurers, Lindbergh's trip was seen as a chance to move forward. Many had begun to question the necessity of this trip after so many crashes and fatalities. But this success brought as much joy as it brought relief. People finally had their hero, the man who crossed the Atlantic, to only think what could have been if the White Bird had completed its journey. But amongst the questions of what could have been was the question of what there was. In the pre-digital world, news traveled slowly and was inherently difficult to verify. Many of the originally reported sightings of the White Bird were soon disproven, but authorities were determined to carry out a thorough investigation to make sure no stone was left unturned. Over the next 8 weeks, the Cotton Relief Expedition was launched throughout Newfoundland, spanning 15,000 square miles. Although they didn't return any credible physical evidence of the plane's whereabouts, a pattern of eyewitness statements arose, which implied that Coli and Nungesser had indeed reached the shores of North America. America. Documents revealed that Newfoundland became a hotbed for testimonies from civilians who had observed some sort of anomalous contraption in the air. A telegraph operator at Old Pelican, Seaman Arthur Doyle on Gull Island, multiple witnesses in the settlement of Harbor Grace, and a lobsterman over by the Bay of Fundy. Authorities mapped out a perceptible flight route from the statements given. This route takes the White Bird southwest across Newfoundland towards Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. However, after this, the sightings became more scattered, and although some witnesses placed Nungesser and Coli in other parts of Canada, and others even making their entry into the United States of America, the trail goes mostly cold. A clear pattern of eyewitness statements cannot be ignored, especially in Newfoundland, where residents weren't strangers to identifying aircrafts. But it does create one of the greatest points of contention in this story. If Nungesser and Coli made it to Newfoundland, then they actually navigated the most challenging part of the flight route. Although the weather wasn't exactly clement around Canada at the time, it shouldn't have posed any great challenge for two experienced aviators who had just emerged from a storm that many did not dare to take on. Where then was the White Bird? In the coming months, years, and decades, interest mostly waned as few major discoveries were made relating to the case. Theories continued to circulate as to how far the Frenchmen had flown before they vanished. Theories that we'll discuss in due course. But in the 1980s, over 50 years after many had given up their search for Nungesser and Coli, renewed interest was sparked by a number of revelations. In June of 1980, Gunnar Henson, Northeast Harbor resident, author, and actor known for portraying Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, published an article in Yankee magazine promoting the theory that the French aviators had made it to North America, but going further to suggest that they landed in Maine, publishing archival testimony from a man by the name of Anson Berry, a woodsman who lived not far from Round Lake in the state. He was reported to have heard an engine approaching and sputtering on May 9th, after which a faint crashing noise. Berry could not investigate this at the time, and he could not provide any visual confirmation on account of the inclement weather. But given the rarity of airplanes from around that area and the corroboration from other witness statements, this seemed like promising evidence, albeit not proof. With this information, though, Hansen decided to further investigate this theory. He plotted all the report sightings and found that they charted a tangible route to coastal Maine. Soon, he unearthed a report by Hunter Ray Beck, who stated that he had spotted an engine in the forest in the early 1950s, but had shrugged it off. This wasn't the first time that Wreckage had been observed, supposedly belonging to the White Bird. In 1947, it was reported that wreckage was found in the Great Gull Pond of Newfoundland, and in 1961, Maine fishermen recovered parts of a plane that some claimed belonged to the White Bird. None of these findings were ever fully verified to belong to the missing airplane, though. But with revived attention on the case and the combination of evidence available, larger institutes began to take an interest as well. Throughout much of the early 1980s, searches would mostly consist of Hansen and peers flying over and performing routine walkthroughs of areas suspected to be the site of the downed French aircraft, while also communicating with the French government and other institutes to acquire information that could be useful in identifying parts of the plane if encountered. In April 1984, however, new developments occurred that once again set the case alight. Richard Gillespie, former military pilot, aviation insurance executive, and future founder of the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, also known as TIGCAR, announced that he and his two brothers would be spearheading an investigation and a subsequent search for the missing aircraft, called Project Midnight Ghost, after Lindbergh's famous quote about the Frenchman's fate. Gillespie had support from NASA, other prolific American institutions, the French government, whose Ministry of Transport would soon post their own findings into the circumstances surrounding the missing biplane, and Gunnar Hansen. If anyone could find this elusive piece of machinery, then it was thought to be Gillespie, though his shock as to how it had taken so long wasn't exactly a secret. It kind of puzzles me as to why no one ever cared enough to try to find them in Maine, said Gillespie. After all, their disappearance was part of what enabled the cultural catalyst of Charles Lindbergh to succeed. But was Gillespie looking in the right place? The French Ministry of Transport's report concluded that in light of the overwhelming testimony, they could not rule out the possibility that Coli and Nungesser had reached Newfoundland, in spite of their hesitancy to state with certainty on the specific crash landing site. They also consider Maine as a possibility, though with the same confidence that they view Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. It's clear that they are not as certain as Hansen or Gillespie that the secrets to this aircraft lie in or around Round Lake, but that wasn't going to stop these bold American researchers from trying. Based on their research of the calculated distance that Coli and Nungesser could have flown, and the well-corroborated testimony of Anson Berry, Ray Beck, and Norman Foss, the latter who came forward with his own claims around 10 days after the announcement of Project Midnight Ghost, Gillespie and company set their sights on Round Lake, Maine, as the location of their first frisking, which was scheduled for October 1984. The research team was composed of scientists, pilots, historical researchers, detectionists, and many more, and was co-sponsored by the Franklin Institute, with assistance from the Smithsonian Institution. Frisking was anticipated to initiate early morning on Saturday the 20th of October, before concluding at around 2 p.m. on that Sunday. Despite 4 years of preparation and research, the significant scientific backing and local interest, outlets did not report on any exciting new findings. In 1985, however, Gillespie's newly founded organization, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, announced that they had discovered evidence of significance in the search for the whereabouts of the white bird. That they had, however, opted to withhold the information from the press while they carry out more research. They also state that they intend to head back up to Maine once more to pursue the recovery of Nungesser and Coli's aircraft from the New England wilderness, expanding their methods of research in the meantime and inviting the collaboration of more establishments, including the French government, whom Gillespie visited in June of that year. In the third weekend of October, Gillespie and his team returned once more, armed with the research and intelligence accrued over the past year and the backing of their own organization, NASA, and multiple French institutes. They entered with a new resolve and confidence that they would be able to solve this mystery once and for all. Yet again, they were unable to find definitive evidence of the aircraft's presence. Over the next few years, they seemed to make gradual progress, working with a variety of scientific and diplomatic groups and uncovering bits of new evidence and research that may help them lead to the crash site, but nothing that could help them fully unravel the riddle that the two Frenchmen left behind. Other expeditions were also being carried out, the most notable one, Clive Cussler and his organization, the National Underwater and Marine Agency, who was aware of Gillespie and Tikar's work, yet didn't work with him due to personal differences. It seemed like there was a Herculean amount of effort being put into this venture, yet would it yield any results? Over the next few years, Gillespie and his organization continued to search for the remains of the white bird. Under Tikar's commitment, the story grew and grew in national prestige, remaining in media circulation, and even landing a spot on NBC's Unsolved Mysteries in 1989.
The white bird was last seen by escort planes as it crossed the coast of France and headed out over the vast reaches of the Atlantic. It was never seen again. Most experts assumed the plane simply crashed at sea.
Small pieces of evidence were uncovered during the multiple expeditions that had been launched in this time. Black boxes of information were filled in, and further witnesses came forward, in spite of the now growing list of local residents who now corroborated Anson Berry's testimony of hearing a low-flying aircraft on the day that Nungesser and Coli are widely believed to have crashed their plane. The final step, actually recovering the defining pieces of the puzzle, most notably the engine, seemed impossible. Recovered evidence implied the presence of an aircraft, metal remnants that could constitute items from a French flying machine created in the 1920s, but nobody could say it did. One of the explanations for this was that the proof had already been removed, claims that were supported by a witness who stated that the engine had already been removed sometime in the 1970s, that he'd seen this on a local TV program, and that the program confirmed this to be the remains of the white bird. This claim was endorsed by 2 other people, but although there was compelling evidence that a large load had been transported from the forest in the 1970s, no TV footage could be located that confirmed what this cargo was, and the trail went cold once more. Was the smoking gun just out of reach, or were we further away than ever from finding the truth? In October of 1990, on Expedition 19 of the Round Lake Forest area, Gillespie made the most significant discovery yet: the alleged location of the wreckage that had been hauled away many years before, and thus the alleged original crash site of the white bird. They recovered the additional debris from the site and planned their return to definitively state whether this evidence would uncover the truth about the Frenchman's fate. In April of the following year, they returned once more with Expedition 20, with high hopes as to finally designating the third Round Lake Hill as a spot of great historical significance. Yet, despite years of tracing and researching this seemingly strong and well-corroborated lead, the conclusions were that there simply wasn't enough debris for this to be the crash site of the white bird, and that these remains had been removed long before the 1970s. This was disappointing news for anyone who was invested in the case, leaving many wondering if they were back at square one. Yet, in spite of this setback, a new area of interest was emerging, and it was one that had been visited before. Newfoundland was the subject of the most eyewitness reports at the time of the white bird's disappearance, giving it more chronological credibility. The French Ministry of Transport's report expressed the most confidence in the plane's presence over the Canadian island, and it would have been the first place that the French pilots would have made landfall. But even if they made it there, the question was, did they crash there?
When the sky finally opened up, they had already made the Atlantic. Below them was the country of Newfoundland. But they were 3 hours behind schedule and they were in trouble. Frantically, they followed the coast south, trying to get a critical navigation bearing that would send them safely skyward for New York.
In September 1992, TCAR announced that they were shifting the focus of their investigation to the Canadian island of Newfoundland, part of the province, Newfoundland and Labrador. Alongside the substantial circumstantial evidence, Gillespie also states that their interest was catalyzed by photographic evidence that aircraft debris had been recovered that could come from biplanes akin to the one flown by Coli and Nungesser. It was thought that the plane may have downed in one of the many lakes around Newfoundland, so the search of the water was just as important as the search of the ground. Gillespie and TCAR's research took them to Gulf Pond, a lake in the southwestern corner of the Avalon Peninsula. A string of testimonials dating back to shortly after the white bird's disappearance told a clear story. First, eyewitness accounts of a plane on fire by Red Head, of the plane on the lake whose parts had been gradually removed by passerbys. This was supported by anecdotes from locals and archival documents from Newfoundland authorities. The October 1992 search revealed no definitive results, and the piece of aircraft was identified as being World War II. However, Gillespie did recover what appeared to be a painted cylinder that they hoped could be part of an airplane, one that, on preliminary comparisons, did broadly match the hue of the landing gear discarded by Nungesser and Coli at the start of their transatlantic flight. However, although this evidence was significant, the theory and subsequent investigation was still beset by multiple logistical issues. Although the Newfoundland theory was well substantiated and supported by many independent studies, it possessed a much broader scope than Maine. Now, any part of Canada is already large, and most of it is an unwelcoming and inaccessible environment to the average person. Gull Pond was no exception, although the increased availability of all-terrain vehicles aided the site's convenience. It was still an arduous trip, and not one that you could make without intensive planning, and that doesn't even begin to concern the hypothetical issue of making sure you have the right location. Given they intended to land in New York Harbor and the absence of any landing gear, it can be said with reasonable confidence that Nungesser and Coli would have aimed to land on water under emergency circumstances. Gull Pond has the misfortune of being in Canada. This is nothing against the country or the people who live there, but more the fact that a lake in Canada is about as common as a tree in the rainforest. In Newfoundland alone, there are multiple bodies of water named Gull Pond. Canada has the most designated lakes in the world by a large margin, and even if you wanted to sweep every lake in the Avalon Peninsula, you would have to use a lot more resources than you likely possess. The cylinder retrieved by Gillespie did seem to aid his theory, but future expeditions struggled to return any other clear remnants of an aircraft. Part of this was hypothesized to be due to the fact that much of the aircraft remains had been removed from the site by locals, predominantly through the 30s and 40s. This was based on corroborating testimonies and a story of the quote plane in the lake that had been investigated in the 1970s. However, this still didn't explain the lack of an engine or anything else that would have sunk on impact. Even if the retrieved cylinder did belong to the white bird, it wasn't out of the question that it had been discarded there by another party who found it elsewhere. Whether we were closer to the truth on a logical basis without a certain crash site, the closure that many researchers sought could not feel farther away. TCAR returned to Gull Pond and the surrounding territory multiple times over the coming years. However, in spite of the technological developments and gathered intelligence, they were still unable to locate the remains of the missing French plane and suspended their search, focusing on other projects. Other small groups of holdouts continued to search for evidence of the plane's existence, but didn't turn up any results that would attract further funding or support, and over time, the case largely grew cold. However, discourse was revived at the end of the 2000s by one of Nungesser and Coli's compatriots, Bernard Decré. Bernard Decré is a French businessman, aviator, and founder of France's national yachting race. He took an interest in the story of the white bird after reading one of Live Kussler's books and decided that he too would chance his arm at uncovering the elusive remains. Armed with an abundance of resources, he decided to approach the case of the missing French aviators from a slightly different perspective. Although accepting the common wisdom that Nungesser and Coli likely made it to somewhere around North America, he decided that he would mainly focus his search on probably the most vast target possible. Calling upon contemporaneous evidence from the diary of a fisherman who, on May 9th of 1927, claimed to have heard an aircraft struggling and calls for help around the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, Decrès decreed that he would be conducting a sea-based search around the islands. This attracted the support of the French Navy, alongside other regional sponsors who helped Decrès equip sonar and a magnetometer in aiding his mission. Over the next few years, he would carry out thorough searches with a dedicated team, gradually moving westward across the Atlantic towards Newfoundland. His MO was simple. His magnetometer and sonar would pick up any discrepancies, and his divers would investigate, with the first reconnaissance mission scheduled for May 2009. This search didn't return much information, but over the years, Decrès reformed his process and intensified his research, leading to more evidence that he believed blew the case wide open. 5 years after an old book gifted by his daughter had turned his attention towards the case of the missing French aviators, and nearly 84 years after their disappearance, Bernard Decrès was trawling through the National Archives in Washington, D.C. A personal passion project, it would be a surprise that one French businessman would be able to unearth anything that past investigators couldn't. Yet, on February the 21st of 2011, he published an article on his blog claiming that late last year he'd found evidence that the white bird wasn't just found, but also had been rescued and recovered shortly after it crashed. The evidence in question were 2 separate reports from American Coast Guards, who report 2 separate instances of ships picking up both an aileron and the white wings of a plane in May and August, respectively, of 1927. Being French, Decrès had long been skeptical of the American authorities and their handling of the white bird's disappearance, and this seemed to only intensify following the 2011 discovery. In 1958, a fisherman off the coast of Maine recovered what appeared to be a piece of white aircraft. Photographs were taken, and it was speculated whether it was indeed Coli and Nungesser's missing plane. This was rather quickly dismissed by individuals who took a closer look, and the contents were turned over to a scrap metal dealer. But in 2012, Decrès challenged their qualifications and asserted that they had no interest in verifying this information, that going off the photographs, the item must have originated from mainland Europe, and that this could indeed have been the remains of the white bird. These claims were rejected by other investigators, including Tikar, who state that the claims of wreckage off the coast of the United States are improbable, as the jet stream would have carried them in the opposite direction. Yet, in spite of his detractors, Decrès continued to build a case, one that was warmly received by France and the French people in particular, eventually resulting in the Parisian road named after Nungesser and Coli being modified to include the information that the 2 aviators likely made it to North America. In February 2018, a French blog post entitled "The Truth About the Disappearance of the White Bird" was published by Decrès. In this post, he posits the claim that the white bird's disappearance was no fault of Nungesser or Coli, and in fact that they had been shot upon by smugglers and possibly the American Navy. Decrès repeatedly draws attention to the ship, the USCGC Modoc, a ship whose logbook was allegedly rewritten on the day of the incident and seemingly had correspondence with Senator Hamilton Fish III, who Decrès claims had vested interest in a competing plane. Whether accidental or not, Decrès states that the incriminating bullet holes would have meant that the incident would need to be covered up, and a narrative composed to say that the Frenchman had perished in the English Channel. Any future evidence that was recovered was either hidden or dismissed as not belonging to the missing biplane. Decrès claims that he held an interview with the head of the evidential analysis shortly after the 1958 discovery, and that his wife stated that he had been ordered to say that they weren't pieces of the white bird. The implication of all this evidence is that the US thwarted the Frenchman's attempt to cross the Atlantic and subsequently recovered and destroyed any evidence of their involvement. This perspective isn't wholly unsubstantiated, and Decrès wasn't the first person to propose that they had been shot down and hidden. In fact, in 1930, an eyewitness allegedly told 2 other French aviators that the rum smugglers on the boat Amistad had brought the plane down, but hadn't mentioned this due to fear for his own life. It could be said that even if the US did not have any role in shooting down the plane, they may wish to cover up any remains out of fear of a diplomatic crisis, as it would now be contended that Nungesser and Coli would have been the first to make the Atlantic crossing had they not been attacked. There haven't been many updates to this theory since this post, and since 2019, Decrès' personal blog has remained dormant. However, in 2022, he commented on another article reiterating his claims, stating with more certainty that Senator Fish played a role in the plane's demise. Although contentious for many Americans, Decrès' claims remain popular in a country that struggles to accept that 2 of France's most decorated airmen would just vanish without a trace. The allegations posit the question, what if the white bird had already been found by those who didn't want it to be? Can anything even be proven at that point? De Clay's theory is not impossible, and plays into America's reputation for a nation that advances its own interests at any cost. If a country wanted to make two people disappear, it certainly wouldn't have been out of the question. Yet, ultimately, it's a theory based on conditionals and interpretations, something that can't be proven or disproven beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet, although maybe more true for de Clay's hypothesis, it's something that can be said about all of the theories documented. If there was definitive evidence beyond a reasonable doubt of what happened to the Frenchman, nobody would be questioning where to search. There wouldn't be eyewitness statements placing them in three very different and separate locations. There wouldn't be search parties for years and years. Yet, one thing at the heart of each theory is hope, the belief that Charles Nungesser and Francois Coli were accomplished and skilled enough to navigate what many thought was an impossible storm. Yet, in spite of this substantiated and corroborated belief, was the truth much simpler? As humans, our curiosity leads us to seek tangible and substantiated explanation. We want to believe that every mystery is solvable, and that with enough research and tenacity, we'll be able to uncover the truth as to the fate of two people who decided to take on a task never completed before. The one thing that nobody wants to believe is that Nungesser and Coli never even made it close, that they didn't even reach North America, let alone the Atlantic Ocean. At some point over the sea, Nungesser and Coli experienced difficulties that claimed their aircraft and their lives. There is no great eyewitness theory to support this because you can't witness what isn't meant to be seen. And if they never have been found, it goes to say that their demise was never witnessed. This obviously contradicts statements from those who believe they did see what was the white bird, but many witnesses in different locations contradict each other. There is no reality that exists where every theory discussed today is correct, and people's ignorance surrounding air travel at the time does only confuse matters further. The ocean is vast, and if you were lost at sea, particularly in a time with limited technology, there was no guarantee that you would be found, even if you were in a large, conspicuous vehicle. If it took investigators multiple expeditions to investigate a single lake, think what your chances are of finding anything in the Atlantic Ocean, even with advanced technology. If disappearances at sea were rare, we wouldn't have phenomena like the Bermuda Triangle. We wouldn't have a demand for organizations like TIGHAR. Human hope and belief is what drives the theories today, but sometimes Occam's razor leads us to the most uninteresting explanation, that there was no major twist, there was no interference, there wasn't even a landfall. There was just Mother Nature's indomitable force, one that has claimed many great adventurers before, and will claim many to come. This isn't a black mark against the great French pilots. They still led a landmark flight with the odds stacked against them, which was a testament to their ability. But every human has their limits. Maybe on that fateful May day, Nungesser and Coli reached theirs. But I ask you to keep on hoping, Charles Lindbergh. Whether they reached the shores of Maine or barely left the shores of France, we do not know what happened to the white bird, and maybe we're not meant to. The only two people who know exactly what happened to the white bird aren't here today to share their story. But although they may be a footnote in aviation history now, their impact should never be understated. Lindbergh wasn't unaware of the sacrifice of those that had come before him, and visited Nungesser's mother before anyone else, stating that her son's mission was harder than his. In 1928, Le Bourget Aerodome honored Lindbergh, Nungesser, and Coli together with a statue, memorializing their efforts. Another monument was erected in Etretat, but was torn down by Hitler's troops, likely aware of how fundamental its contribution was to national spirit. It was rebuilt after the war, darting out into the ocean like the Frenchman's unwavering ambition and fearlessness. The story of Charles Nungesser and Francois Coli is one from the movies, two striking figures in appearance and personality, different in many ways, but united by the same spirit for achievement and human advance. Their survival stories might have led some to believe that they were immortal and fueled that long-standing belief that they were still out there somewhere, on a wing and a prayer. I prefer to believe that their loss, as heartbreaking as it was, showed their humanity and courage in the face of insurmountable odds. Regardless of their likelihood, and even with the absence of definitive proof, the theories and investigations that followed reflected this spirit, this belief that Nungesser and Coli really did complete the crossing. The square miles of potential crash sites out there are endless, but year after year, people swept areas with metal detectors and sonars in the hope that this mystery could be solved and closure given to the remaining relatives and countrymen of the departed. Bravery or foolishness? A question many likely asked on the 8th of May, 1927, as the white bird lifted off the Parisian runway. When you step inside a commercial airliner today and think of the history associated with it, your mind would likely be drawn to Lindbergh's trailblazing Atlantic crossing in 1927. But little mind is often paid to those who fell before him and the progress they gave in their sacrifice. From Lindbergh to NASA, their influence on aeronautics, past and present, can never be understated.
From the earliest days in my home, this was talked about by my father and by other men who would be in the house at a particular time, and conversations would be on the country. And it was common, not only in my home, but all the homes of the community where men went back in the country.
When did you start to put two and two together?
I never heard my father or any of the men from the community ever refer to Nungesser and Coli. I suspect they didn't know of the transatlantic flights and the implications that it might have for the country.
Nungesser and Coli may be a footnote in aviation history, their disappearance not the first nor the last in a long line of adventurers, but their story, their journey, their mystery underscored the spirit of innovation and discovery, a spirit that opened the door for decades of development and search for the truth in addressing their own fate. What that fate was, we may never know for sure, but one thing we can be sure of is that the mystery that they left behind will continue to attract the eyes and ears of those who can't help but search for answers to the questions that remain.